all for coming. I have the enormous pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening, Steven Pinker, the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. I'll tell you all the general stuff about him, and then I'll have a personal note. I've known Steve since the 1970s, so we go back a bit. Steve conducts research on language and cognition, writes widely for publications including the New York Times, Time, and Slate, the author of 6 books including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, Words and Rules, and The Blank Slate, the title of his talk tonight. He joined Harvard's faculty in 2003 following 21 years of distinguished service at MIT in its Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. A native of Montreal, Steve received his BA from McGill in 1976 and his PhD in psychology from Harvard in 1979. He's a fellow of several leading scholarly societies, including the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His research on visual cognition and the psychology of language have received numerous awards, including the Troland Award from the National Academy of Sciences and the Golden Plate Award from the American Academy of Achievement. In addition to these honors, he has been named among Newsweek's 100 Americans for the next century. I met Steve in 1978. I was a rookie assistant professor at Harvard, and Steve was in his last year of graduate work. And I remember the astounding intellect in Steve Pinker. He was a blazingly bright graduate student who kept young professors and not so young professors hopping with his insightful questions, his astute analyses, and always willing to dare and to try to solve the next great problem of cognition. We were good friends. We were saying over dinner that we scoured just about every restaurant in and about Harvard Square, some of them now closed. We had great conversations, and I deeply appreciate what you've done in the field, and it's clear that you have not missed a beat from the days of graduate school and beyond. He has mentored some of the great cognitive psychologists of our era. He is colleagues with some of the foremost names of the MIT and Harvard faculties in psychology and cognitive science, and he himself is certainly the leader of that pack. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Steven Pinker, distinguished professor from Harvard, and we are honored to have you here as our guest for the Richmond Quest. Steve.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a real honor for me to be here. Bill and I were close and dear friends, and Bill was a mentor of mine, and so it's especially pleasant for me to come here and see the tremendous morale and the tremendous projects and intellectual development at the University of Richmond. So it's a real honor to be here, and I thank all of you for coming. I'm going to talk this evening about the subject matter of my most recent book, The Blank Slate, a book about human nature, a topic of perennial interest, because everyone needs a theory of human nature. Everyone has to anticipate how other people will react to their surroundings, and that means that all of us need theories, implicit or explicit, about what makes people tick. So much depends on our theory of human nature. In our personal lives, we consult it to win friends and influence people, to manage our relationships, to bring up our children, to control our own behavior. Its assumptions about learning guide our policies in education. Its assumptions about motivation guide our policies in law and government. And because a theory of human nature delineates what we can achieve easily, what we can achieve only with effort and pain, and what we cannot achieve at all, it's tied to our values, what we think we can reasonably strive for as individuals and as a society. Because of this tie to values, it should come as no surprise that for millennia, theories of human nature were intimately tied to religion. And the Judeo-Christian religious tradition has in it a theory of human nature covering some of the subject matter that we would today attribute to psychology and biology. For example, the Judeo-Christian theory of the human mind was a modular theory, positing that people are equipped with a capacity for love, a moral sense and an ability to make decisions or free will. And though our free will is not the effect of any cause, it has an innate tendency towards sin. There's a theory of perception and cognition in our religious tradition, namely that our perceptual faculties keep us in touch with reality because God designed them to give us an accurate picture of the world. And there's even a theory of mental health in the Bible, that psychological well-being comes from accepting God's purpose, loving God, and loving our fellow human beings for the sake of God. Now, the Judeo-Christian theory grew out of an interpretation of specific events narrated in the Bible. For example, the doctrine of free will comes from the story in which Adam and Eve were punished for eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, implying that they could have chosen otherwise, therefore free will exists. Now today, no scientifically literate person can believe that the events narrated in the book of Genesis literally took place. And so there's been a need for a new theory of human nature, not tied to fundamentalist interpretations. And a central argument in the Blank Slate is that the standard secular theory of human nature that has become the conventional wisdom is based on three doctrines, each of which can be associated with a dead white European male. First, there's the theory that gives the book its title, the Blank Slate, or tabula rasa, commonly associated with this man, the English philosopher John Locke. John Locke didn't actually use the expression blank slate in his writings, but he did use a similar metaphor. He said, "Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? To this I answer in one word, from experience." This is the doctrine of the blank slate. Now, the blank slate was not just an empirical hypothesis in Locke's time, but it also had a great deal of moral and political appeal. It implied that dogmas, such as the divine right of kings, could not be treated as self-evident truths that just emerged from the structure of the brain, but had to be justified by experiences that people shared and hence could debate. It undermined a hereditary royalty and aristocracy who could claim no innate wisdom or virtue if their minds started out as blank as everyone else's. And by the same token, it undermined the institution of slavery by holding that slaves could no longer be considered innately inferior or subservient. These ideas are summed up in a cartoon that I clipped out of the New Yorker about 10 years ago, in which one king says to the other, "I don't know much about the bell curve, but I say heredity is everything." The blank slate is not ancient history, but it continues to have an influence in intellectual life. For most of the 20th century, psychology tried to explain all human behavior by invoking a couple of simple mechanisms of conditioning and association. The social sciences have tried to explain all of human experience in terms of culture, seen as an autonomous force that can't be identified with anything in the heads of individual men and women. Here's a representative quotation from a well-known 20th century social scientist. "With the exception of the instinctoid reactions in infants to sudden withdrawals of support and to sudden loud noises, the human being is entirely instinctless. Man is man because he has no instincts, because everything he is and has become, he has learned, acquired from his culture, from the man-made part of the environment, from other human beings." That's a quote from the anthropologist and prolific public intellectual Ashley Montagu. Just to show how far this idea has spread, I'm going to quote to you from another well-known 20th century figure who used another metaphor for this idea. He said, "When kids go to school at the age of 6, there's an empty bucket there, and someone, by the time they're 18, will fill that bucket. Is it going to be a parent? Is it going to be a good educator? Or is it going to be some other scum out there who's going to fill that bucket?" And that is a quote from the governor of California. Several years before he was governor, I might add. Well, there's a second doctrine that makes up the conventional wisdom on human nature, and my name for it comes from a poem by John Dryden called "The Conquest of Grenada" that begins, "I am as free as nature first made man, ere the base laws of servitude began, when wild in woods the noble savage ran." Now, the noble savage is more commonly associated with this gentleman, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And here's what Rousseau wrote. He said, "So many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. The example of the savages seems to confirm that mankind was formed ever to remain in this condition, and that all ulterior improvements have been so many steps towards the decrepitness of the species." Now, you can only really understand someone writing in a previous century if you know who he was arguing against. And in Rousseau's case, he alluded to so many authors, but there was one author in particular that he had in mind. This gentleman, who painted a rather different picture of life in a state of nature. This man wrote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." This, of course, is the famous quotation from Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. Now, Rousseau's alternative of the noble savage was considerably more appealing. It implied that there was no need for a domineering Leviathan, a government and police force to keep us from each other's throats. If we're basically nasty, then we have to accept conflict as a permanent part of our condition. Whereas if we're basically noble, we can work toward a utopian society of the future. Children are born savages, so if our inner savage is nasty, that means that bringing up children will be a matter of discipline and conflict. Whereas if our inner savage is noble, it means that bringing up children is a matter of providing them with opportunities to develop their potential. The noble savage, like the blank slate, continues to be influential. I think it's behind the widespread respect for everything natural and a distrust of anything man-made. It's behind the unfashionability of authoritarian styles of child-rearing, which were popular just a couple of generations ago. And it's behind the common understanding of our social problems as repairable defects in our institutions, which contrasts with a more traditional view that would have them be part of the inherent tragedy of the human condition. And there's a third doctrine that often accompanies the blank slate and the noble savage, often associated with another French philosopher, René Descartes. Descartes wrote, "When I consider my mind, I cannot distinguish any parts, but apprehend it to be clearly one and entire. But it is quite otherwise with corporeal objects, for there is not one of them imaginable by me which my mind cannot easily divide into parts. This is sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body," an idea that much later was ridiculed as the doctrine of the ghost in the machine, a phrase we owe to the English philosopher Gilbert Ryle. It was only later that it was used as the title of an album by the rock group The Police. The ghost in the machine was an appealing doctrine because people don't like to think of themselves as glorified clockwork. Machines are insensate and have some workaday purpose, like grinding corn or sharpening pencils. Humans, we like to think, are sentient and have some higher purpose, such as the love, worship, or the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. Machines follow the ineluctable laws of physics, whereas behavior is freely chosen. With choice comes optimism about possibilities for our future, and with choice comes responsibility and the power to hold people accountable for their actions. Finally, if, as Descartes said, the mind is entirely separate from the body, that holds out the hope that the mind can survive the death of the body, an idea whose appeal, I think, is all too obvious. The ghost in the machine continues to be influential. I think it's behind the fact that freedom, dignity, and responsibility are often considered to be incompatible with a biological understanding of the mind, which is commonly denounced as reductionist or determinist. We see it in the stem cell debate, where some of the theologians who've weighed in on this issue have framed it in terms of when ensoulment takes place in embryonic development, which implies that perhaps the most promising medical technology of the 21st century is being debated in terms of when the ghost first enters the machine. And we see it in everyday thinking and speech. It's hard to get away from, as when we talk about John's body or John's brain, implying some entity, John, which is separate from the brain that it possesses. Or when journalists speculate about brain transplants, which in fact they really should call body transplants, because as Dan Dennett once pointed out, this is the one transplant operation where you really want to be the donor, not the recipient. Well, you probably won't be surprised to know that I think that this is all deeply confused, beginning with the doctrine of the blank slate. The problem is that blank slates don't do anything. It's not that any sane person can deny the central importance of learning, socialization, and culture in all aspects of human life. The question is, how do they work? When Locke said there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses, the appropriate reply came from Leibniz when he said, except for the intellect itself. And indeed, the modern sciences of mind that have tried to specify what's in the intellect itself have threatened the blank slate. My own field of cognitive science has tried to delineate the innate mechanisms that must be in place in order to do the learning that we undoubtedly do, such as some concept of a stable object and of lawful causation, a number sense that allows us to conceptualize quantity, a number of spatial representations that allow us to keep track of objects and find our way in the world, a theory of mind or intuitive psychology that allows us to grasp the fact that other people have thoughts and feelings, a language instinct that allows us to communicate our thoughts and feelings to other people, and the executive systems of the frontal lobes of the brain, which take in information from the rest of the brain and execute decision rules that determine how the person behaves. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate by showing that beneath the undeniable fact of variation from culture to culture and society to society, there's a bedrock of human universals, ways of thinking and feeling and behaving that can be found in all of the societies documented by ethnography. The anthropologist Donald Brown has recently cataloged the human universals, and they number some 300, everything from abstraction in speech and thought, aesthetics, affection, and age statuses, all the way down to vowel contrasts, weaning, weapons, attempts to control the weather, and a word for the color white. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate in another way by showing that many human drives can't be understood as ways of maximizing our well-being in our own lifetimes, but can only be understood as adaptations to survival and reproduction in an ancestral environment, the one in which our species spent most of its evolutionary history. An obvious example is our taste for sugar and fat, which sends many people to an early grave from too much junk food, but which clearly had a rationale in a world in which starvation was never far away, in which these nutrient and calorie-rich substances were rare and precious, and one could never consume too much of them. Recently, we've developed the technologies to crank out mass quantities of the stuff. Our tastes haven't changed, and so we eat more of them than is good for us. Another example is the thirst for revenge, which is the source of much human suffering in the form of vendettas and blood feuds and cycles of violence, but which clearly had a rationale in a world in which you couldn't dial 911 to get Leviathan to show up to settle your scores for you, but in which a reputation for toughness and a resolve to retaliate against injury was one's only defense against becoming a permanent punching bag. And less obviously, our desire for attractive mates needs an explanation. Now, the humorist Fran Lebowitz once posed a profound paradox for psychology when a reporter asked her why she'd never gotten married. And she said, people who marry someone that they're attracted to are making a terrible mistake. You really should marry your best friend. You like your best friend more than you're apt to like anyone you happen to find physically attractive. Now, you wouldn't pick your best friend because they have a cute nose, but that's all you're doing when you're getting married. You're saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you because of your lower lip. Now, this is a puzzle, and I think the resolution comes from research in evolutionary psychology showing that the physical signs of beauty are indicators of underlying fertility and health, that by being attracted to people with those physical cues, we're maximizing the chances that our genes will combine with the fittest genes available in the population. Neuroscience has undermined the blank slate by showing that there's a complex genetic patterning to the brain, An example being this diagram of the primate visual system, comprising some 50 distinct areas interconnected in precise ways, laid out during embryonic development. And it's not just the overall block and arrow diagram of the brain that seems to be influenced by the genes, but some of its fine structure as well. I'm going to describe the results of an experiment by Paul Thompson and colleagues at UCLA, in which they used MRI to map and measure the distribution of gray matter in the cerebral cortex of a sample of people that they arranged into pairs. And they correlated how much gray matter was in one part of a person's brain and how much gray matter was in the other person's brain in that same region, and plotted the correlations in false color so that purple indicated a lack of a significant correlation, and various other colors indicated successively stronger degrees of statistically significant correlation. Now, when you pair people at random, by definition, the correlations are zero, and so you have a uniformly purple brain, here shown in the left hemisphere view, the right hemisphere view, and a top view of the brain. This is what happens in people who share half their genes, namely fraternal twins. And as you can see, most of the brain is correlated in the distribution of gray matter. And this is what happens in people who share all their genes, namely identical twins. And as you can see, vastly more areas of the brain show even higher correlations. Now, you might ask at this point, are these just meaningless differences in anatomy, like the precise squiggles of your outer ear? In fact, they do seem to have functional consequences. Best summed up in another cartoon from the New Yorker, in which you see two inventors with identical contraptions in their lap who bump into each other in the waiting room of a patent attorney. And the caption is, "Separated at birth, the Malafert twins meet accidentally." Now, the cartoon is only something of an exaggeration of the truth, because studies of identical twins who were given up at birth and then tracked down and tested in adulthood show that they often have astonishing similarities. My favorite example is the pair of twins, one of whom was brought up as a Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany. The other was brought up by a Jewish adoptive father in Trinidad. When they bumped into each other in the lab in their 40s, they both showed up wearing identical navy blue shirts with epaulets. Both of them had rubber bands around their wrists. Both of them, it turned out, liked to dip buttered toast in coffee. Both of them flushed the toilet before using it, as well as after. And both of them liked to sneeze in crowded elevators to watch the other people jump. Now, some of these might be coincidences, what one would discover if one scrutinized any two biographies in enough detail, but these coincidences are never found in fraternal twins who were separated at birth and tested in adulthood. And they've been corroborated in by a variety of objective measures, such as scores on tests of intelligence and personality, and real-life behaviors, such as probability of getting divorced, of getting in trouble with the law, number of books read in a year, likelihood of being addicted to tobacco and alcohol, and so on. So this leads to what behavioral geneticists call the first law of behavioral genetics, namely that all behavioral traits are partially heritable. The noble savage has also been threatened by recent research. Behavioral genetics has shown that among these heritable traits are having an antagonistic personality, a tendency toward violent crime, and a lack of conscience or psychopathy. Neuroscience has underscored brain mechanisms associated with aggression, and evolutionary psychology and anthropology have showed the ubiquity of conflict in human affairs, as one would expect as the product of a Darwinian process. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is a graph from the anthropologist Lawrence Keeley showing the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a number of societies. That is, if you're a man, what are the chances that you will die at the hands of another man as opposed to passing away of natural causes? The various red bars show the percent of male deaths due to warfare in a number of pre-state societies in the Amazon rainforest and New Guinea highlands. And they range from a low of about 15% to a high of almost 60%. The tiny little blue bar in the lower left-hand corner shows the same statistic from the United States and Europe in the 20th century, and it includes all the casualties of both world wars. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. What about our own culture? How did we manage to enjoy this comparatively low rate of homicide? Is it because human nature has somehow been re-engineered from scratch in our society? Well, that seems unlikely. I'm going to describe the results of a number of experiments by social psychologists in which they pose the following question to their subjects. Have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? Okay, think about it. Don't raise your hand, just think about it. Well, the results are that about a third of men and about 15% of women frequently think about killing people they don't like. Most often, romantic rivals, step-parents, and people who've humiliated them in public. About 3/4 of men and more than 60% of women at least occasionally think about killing people they don't like. And of course, the rest of them are lying. But it's the ghost in the machine that has been subject to the most thoroughgoing threat. Cognitive science has shown that this formerly mysterious power called intelligence can be explained in mechanistic terms by thinking of beliefs as a kind of information, of thinking as a kind of computation, not the kind of computation your PC does, but presumably a kind of parallel, analog, fuzzy computation, but computation nonetheless, and that desires and drives can be understood in cybernetic terms as mechanisms of feedback and control. Artificial intelligence has actually built intelligence systems out of hunks of matter, most famously the computer program Deep Blue, which defeated the world chess champion Garry Kasparov 7 years ago. And neuroscience has threatened the ghost in the machine through what Francis Crick has called the astonishing hypothesis, the idea that all of our thoughts and feelings and experiences consist of physiological activity in the tissues of the brain. And though this is an astonishing hypothesis to many people, there's increasing reason to believe that it's true. We know that the mind is affected by electrical signals, and that if a neurosurgeon stimulates the exposed cerebral cortex in a neurosurgery patient, the person can undergo a vivid, lifelike experience indistinguishable from reality. We know that the mind runs on chemistry, as we see in the dramatic effects on mood and personality of psychoactive drugs. We know that surgery can rearrange the mind, most famously in the case of split brain patients, in which a neurosurgeon will sever the corpus callosum joining the two cerebral hemispheres, resulting in two largely independent consciousnesses co-residing in the same skull, as if the soul could be bisected with a knife. We know that damage to the brain can eliminate a part of the person and leave someone incapable of recognizing a face, for example, or making a moral choice. So Descartes was literally incorrect when he said the mind is one and indivisible. We know that the brain has a fantastic complexity, 100 billion neurons interconnected by 100 trillion synapses, which is fully commensurate with the staggering complexity of human thought and behavior. And there's every reason to think that when the physiological activity of the brain stops, the person goes out of existence, despite concerted efforts by some respectable 19th century scientists. No one has yet figured out a way to communicate with the dead. Now, although many of these discoveries are recent, the basic idea has been glimpsed for more than a century, perhaps most vividly in the quotation from the brothers Karamazov, in which Dmitry Karamazov, sitting in his prison cell, has recently been visited by a local medical researcher, and he's now recounting to his brother what he's just learned. He says, imagine, inside, in the nerves, in the head, there are sort of little tails. I look at something with my eyes, and when they begin quivering, those little tails, an image appears. That is an object or an action, damn it. That's why I see and then think, because of those tails, not because I've got a soul and that I am some sort of image and likeness. Rakuten explained it all to me yesterday, brother, and it simply bowled me over. It's magnificent, Alyosha, this science. A new man's arising. That I understand, and yet I am sorry to lose God. Now, many people are sorry to lose God when they hear these ideas, or at least sorry to lose the values that have traditionally been associated with God. There's been a widespread fear and loathing of this revival of human nature, both from the left and from the right. From the academic left, there was a vehement and sometimes violent reaction to these ideas when they were first publicized by E.O. Wilson in his book Sociobiology in the mid-70s. An example being this manifesto in the New York Review of Books by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin called Against Sociobiology, that said, among other things, the reason for the survival of these recurrent determinist theories is that they consistently tend to provide a genetic basis for the status quo and of existing privileges for certain groups according to class, race, or sex. These theories provided an important basis for the enactment of sterilization laws and also for the eugenics policies which led to the establishment of gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And because of these accusations, Wilson was often hounded by protesters when he spoke on college campuses, as we see in this poster from the mid-1980s that says, "Come and hear Edward O. Wilson, sociobiologist and the prophet of right-wing patriarchy," and at the bottom of the poster it says, "Bring noisemakers." But for all that, the right-wing patriarchy wasn't so thrilled with these ideas either. And we see the religious and cultural right showing signs of alarm, such as this editorial in the Weekly Standard, a conservative opinion magazine, that says, "Biological theories of the mind are sure to give you the creeps, because whether a behavior is moral, whether it signifies virtue, is a judgment that the new science and materialism in general cannot make." He contrasted it with the Judeo-Christian theory of the mind that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, according to which human beings are persons from the start, endowed with a soul, created by God, and infinitely precious. And this is the common understanding the new science means to undo. Now, it's not just opinion magazines in which these concerns have been voiced, but the actual halls of power. For example, this is Tom DeLay's theory of the cause of the Columbine High School shootings 6 years ago. He said that such outbreaks of violence are inevitable because our school systems teach children that they are nothing but glorified apes evolutionized out of some primordial soup of mud. And in the same vein, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee heard the following testimony about the dangers of Darwinism from a creationist study group. They quoted the lyrics of a rock song. "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do it on the Discovery Channel." Well, these are serious concerns, and I think they have to be addressed with care. And in the rest of the talk, I'm going to lay out where I think this anxiety comes from. I'm going to suggest that there are 4 reasons that people fear human nature: the fear of inequality, the fear of imperfectibility, the fear of determinism, the fear of nihilism. I'll explain what I mean by each of those shortly. And what I will show is that they are all non sequiturs. They all come from the fact that these ideas are so unfamiliar, not because the conclusions actually follow from any of the discoveries. But I'll take it a bit further and argue that even if there are dangers in affirming too strong a version of human nature, there are also dangers in denying human nature. And for this reason, we should study human beings objectively and not try to put a moral thumb on either side of the scale. Well, let me start with the fear of inequality. This comes from a simple mathematical truth, namely 0 equals 0 equals 0. If we're blank slates, we must be equal, therefore, but if the mind has any innate organization, then different races, sexes, or individuals could be biologically different, and that would condone discrimination and oppression. Well, I think it's easy to see what's wrong with this argument. Namely, it confuses the idea of fairness with the idea of sameness. Now, when the Declaration of Independence said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," it did not mean, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are clones." Rather, a commitment to political equality means, to begin with, an acknowledgement of certain human universals, as we see in the continuation that people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also, a commitment to equality is a policy to prohibit discrimination against individuals based on the averages of certain groups they belong to, such as their race, ethnicity, or sex. And one can maintain a commitment to political equality in the sense of treating people fairly, namely as individuals, regardless of what the facts eventually turn out to be about whether various races, sexes, or classes are biologically different or not. Now, I mentioned that there are downsides in denying human nature, And these include downsides of denying the possibility of innate individual differences. The main danger is to treat more successful people as larcenous or avaricious. The idea is that if everyone started out the same, and some people end up with more stuff than others, well, they must have stolen more than their fair share and should be punished. And indeed, this mentality led to the persecution and indeed genocide of the so-called kulaks, or rich peasants, in Stalinist and Leninist Russia. Similarly, the rich peasants during the Cultural Revolution in China and the genocide in Cambodia. And it's also led to the persecution of certain ethnic groups that set up the social conditions that allowed their more talented members to prosper, resulting in them being singled out by the surrounding society as bloodsuckers and parasites, leading often to the entire group being subjected to pogroms and expulsions and sometimes genocides. Examples are the overseas Chinese in Indonesia and Malaysia, the Indians in East Africa and the South Pacific, the Igbos in Nigeria, and the Jews in Europe. The second fear is the fear of imperfectibility, the dashing of the age-old dream of the perfectibility of humankind. And it runs more or less as follows. If ignoble traits are innate, such as selfishness, violence, prejudice, or rape, that would make them unchangeable, so attempts at social reform and human improvement would be a waste of time. In other words, why try to make the world a better place if people are rotten to the core and will just screw it up no matter what you do? Well, the response to that is that ignoble motives do not automatically lead to ignoble behavior, as we see in the prevalence of homicidal fantasies among people who clearly would never commit a homicide in real life. And that's precisely because the human mind is a complex system with many parts. Some parts can counteract others, such as a moral sense, cognitive faculties that allow us to acquire lessons of history, and the executive systems of the frontal lobes that combine moral intuitions and a knowledge of history to inhibit behavior. Indeed, the undeniable social progress that has taken place within the last several thousand years did not come from wiping out human nature and replacing it with something different, but rather by taking one aspect of human nature that was there all along and expanding its range of application. I have in mind an idea by the philosopher Peter Singer in his book, The Expanding Circle, that there's evidence that all human societies have a capacity for empathy, an ability to treat other people's interests as equivalent to one's own. Unfortunately, the default setting for this empathy faculty is to restrict it to a very narrowly circumscribed circle of people in your own family or village or clan. People outside that circle are considered less than human and can be exploited with impunity. But what one sees over the millennia is this moral circle expanding outwards to first encompass other clans within the tribe, then other tribes within the nation, then other nations within the race, then other races, and most recently, in the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, it's been extended to all of humanity. This massive moral change could take place without replacing human nature with something completely different, but rather by adjusting a knob or slider that controls the size of the circle that embraces those entities whose interests we treat as comparable to our own. Well, what about the downsides? Perfectibility of humankind sounds like a rather rosy, uplifting, optimistic doctrine. But in fact, it has a number of dark sides. The first is an invitation to totalitarian social engineering. The temptation is for dictators to think, if people are blank slates, well, we just better control what gets written on those slates instead of leaving it up to chance. Which is why I think that many of the worst autocrats of the 20th century explicitly avowed a belief in the blank slate. Mao Zedong, for example, had a famous saying, "It is on a blank page that the most beautiful poems are written." The Khmer Rouge, who killed a quarter of their countrymen in Cambodia, had a slogan, "Only the newborn baby is spotless." And less horrifically, we see this mentality in the form of city planners of the 20th century, such as Le Corbusier, who said that planners should begin with a clean tablecloth, there's the metaphor again, We must build places where mankind will be reborn. Now, here's an example of what Le Corbusier had in mind. This is his drawing of central Paris, or at least what Paris would have looked like if he had been granted his wish to bulldoze the existing city and start over again with a clean tablecloth. It's an example of what historians sometimes call authoritarian high modernism, the conceit that societies can be planned from the top down by authorities using scientific principles rooted in a conception of human needs. The problem was that their theory of human needs was the blank slate. The idea was that a given human needs so many cubic feet of air per minute to breathe, so many gallons of water per day for breathing and washing, a place to eat, a place to sleep, a way to commute to work, and that was pretty much it. And the most efficient way of satisfying those needs would be to stack people up in concrete high-rises connected by superhighways. What they forgot was the rest of human nature, the need for intimate social interaction in comfortable public places, the need for green space and its effect on well-being, the effect of natural light on mood, the need for visual aesthetics and hence ornamentation and design in architecture, the feeling of safety that comes from buildings built on a human scale, and so on. And though Le Corbusier didn't get his wish to flatten Paris and rebuild it according to his scientific principles, it was his disciples who designed the notorious wasteland known as Brasilia, and who were also responsible for the so-called urban renewal movements of the late 50s and early 60s, in which vibrant American neighborhoods often were bulldozed and replaced by scenes that looked much like this. Now, a second downside of a belief in perfectibility, and a complementary one, is a lack of appreciation for democracy. Now, it turns out that many of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century were actually based on a rather romantic view of human nature. They were led by idealistic, charismatic leaders who based their authority on a claim of moral purity and moral superiority to their predecessors. And they argued that their repressive measures were temporary and would gradually wither away, leading people to spontaneously cooperate in a state of utopian anarchism. And the result have been some of the worst dictatorships in human history. In contrast, democracy is based on a rather jaundiced view of human nature, best summed up in the quotation by James Madison: "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, no controls on government would be necessary." And it's this mentality that led to the permanent need of a government of laws and not men, and for the checks and balances that are built into democracies as a specific explicit measure designed to counteract the ambition and self-deception of leaders thought to be a permanent consequence of an unchanging human nature. Now, the third downside of a belief in perfectibility, I think, is a distortion of human relationships, especially parenting, for it's parents, above all, who are thought to write on a blank slate. Here's a quote from a mother who's been interviewed for an article in the Boston Globe with the sarcastic title, "How to Raise a Perfect Child," about the parental advice industry. She said to the reporter, "I'm overwhelmed with parenting advice. I'm supposed to do lots of physical activity with my kids so I can instill in them a physical fitness habit so they'll grow up to be healthy adults. And I'm supposed to do all kinds of intellectual play so they'll grow up smart. And there are all kinds of play: clay for finger dexterity, word games for reading success, large motor play, small motor play. I feel like I could devote my life to figuring out what to play with my kids." And I think anyone who has known a recent young parent can sympathize with this frazzled mom. Well, here are some sobering facts about the effects of parenting, recently assembled by the psychologist Judith Rich Harris. First of all, most of these studies of parenting on which the experts base their advice are useless. They're useless because they don't control for heritability. They measure some correlation between what parents do and how their children turn out, such as that parents who talk to their kids a lot have kids with more advanced language skills. Parents who spank their kids have kids who grow up to be more violent. Parents who are neither too strict nor too lax have kids who are better adjusted, and so on. They assume that correlation implies causation, and conclude that it must be the parenting that did it. They often don't even test for the possibility that parents supply their children with genes as well as parenting practices, and that these correlations may be showing nothing more than that articulate people tend to have articulate kids, and violent people tend to have violent kids, and sensible people tend to have sensible kids. When you redo the studies with the appropriate genetic controls, the results are bracing. They show, first of all, that siblings separated at birth end up as similar as siblings reared together. Now, remember the Malafert twins. Separated at birth, they bump into each other in the patent attorney office with those identical gadgets in their laps. Now, you might think, what would happen if the Malafert twins had been brought up together? Well, then they would have shared not just their genes, but also their parental environment, so then they should be even more similar. In fact, they're not. Siblings separated at birth are as similar as siblings reared together. And a complementary finding comes from a complementary methodology. If identical twins separated at birth share their genes, don't share their environments, then adopted siblings growing up in the same home share their environment but not their genes. And the result here is that in most studies, adopted siblings, when tested as adults, are not similar at all. They are no more correlated than two people plucked off the street at random. Well, what these results suggest is that children are shaped not by their parents, but in part, though only in part, by their genes, in part by their culture, both the surrounding culture of the class and society, and the children's own culture, which we call their peer group, and in part by sheer chance. Chance events in the development of the brain in utero, whether a set of axons zigged or zagged at a particular day in brain development, and chance events as you live your life, whether you inhaled a virus, whether you were dropped on your head, whether you noticed something that started you off on a train of thought that changed your attitude forever. Now, when many people hear these results, their first reaction is, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my kids? Well, of course it matters how you treat your kids. It matters for a number of reasons, and I'll just mention two. First of all, it's never all right for a parent to beat or belittle or neglect or abuse a child, because those are horrible things for a big, strong person to do to a small, helpless person who's in their care. Parenting, above all, is a moral responsibility. Also, let's say I were to tell you that you don't have the ability to shape the personality of your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend. Now, only a newlywed believes that you can change the personality of your spouse. Nonetheless, when you hear that truism, you'd be unlikely to say, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my spouse? Well, it matters how you treat your spouse to the quality of your marriage, and so it matters how you treat your children to the quality of your relationship with the child, both the quality of home life while the children are small, and the lifelong relationship between parent and child that develops as the children reflect back on how they were treated. And I think this is, it's sort of symptomatic of the wide spread of the blank slate, that people can forget these simple truths, think of parenting as the molding of children like putty, when told that they may not have that power, can't think of a single other reason why they should be nice to their children. And so I think this restores an appreciation of parenting as a human relationship. The third fear is the fear of determinism, that if behavior is caused by a person's biology, he can no longer be held responsible for it. And it's not just a hypothetical fear, as we see in this headline from the Wall Street Journal, "Man's genes made him kill," his lawyers claim. You can exchange your favorite lawyer jokes at this point. Well, the killer gene defense did not prevail in court, and I think it's easy to see why. What do we mean when we say we want to hold someone responsible for their behavior? Well, really what it means is that we impose contingencies on their behavior: reward, punishment, credit, blame. If you rob a liquor store, we'll put you in jail. These contingencies, holding someone responsible, are themselves causes of behavior, environmental causes, but causes nonetheless. We impose them so that fewer people will rob liquor stores. They don't have to appeal to some mysterious notion called free will or to a capricious ghost in the machine, but rather to parts of the brain, parts of the brain that anticipate the consequences of behavior and can inhibit it accordingly. And we can keep this influence on the brain systems for inhibition even as we come to understand the brain systems for temptation. And furthermore, most of the bogus defenses for bad behavior that have been dreamed up by ingenious defense lawyers are more likely to be environmental than biological in the first place, such as the abuse excuse that got the Menendez brothers off the hook in their first trial when their lawyers said that the reason that they shot their parents one day is that they had been abused by them as children. The so-called black rage syndrome offered by the radical lawyer William Kunstler as a way to defend the Long Island Railroad gunman, saying that the reason that one day he started shooting passengers on the train at random is that he exploded under the pressure of living in a racist society. The patriarchy made me do it defense offered for some rapists, saying that they were inflamed by pornographic images or living in a misogynistic culture. And perhaps the first of these comes from the musical West Side Story, in which the street gang, the Jets, offer the following explanation of their behavior to the local police officer. Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing up key that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly, Moses, naturally we're punks. Finally, there's the fear of nihilism, the fear that biology strips life of all meaning and purpose by saying that everything that we hold precious, love, beauty, morality, are just figments of a brain pursuing selfish evolutionary strategies. Now, here's an illustration of the fear of nihilism, again from the comic pages. From the strip Arlo and Janice, one day we have our hero, Arlo, stricken with insomnia, racked by existential doubt, pacing the floors, and he asks his son, "Why am I here?" And the boy says, "To pass on your genes." You still here? Now, admittedly, the answer to pass on your genes is, for many people, not a satisfying answer to the question, why am I here? Now, there are two flavors of the fear of nihilism, religious and secular. The religious version is that people need to believe in a soul which seeks to fulfill God's purpose and is rewarded or punished in an afterlife. And that as soon as people stopped believing in a soul, then we would see, in Nietzsche's words, the total eclipse of all values. Well, I think there's a response to the religious fear, and that is that a belief in a life to come is really not such an uplifting doctrine, because it necessarily devalues life on earth. Now, why do we sometimes remind ourselves of the cliche, life is short? Well, that's an impetus to bury the hatchet in some pointless dispute, to extend a gesture of affection to a friend or a loved one, to vow to use your time productively instead of squandering it. I think one could argue that nothing gives life more meaning than the realization that every moment of consciousness is a precious gift. As for God's purpose, have you ever noticed that in practice, God's purpose is always conveyed by other human beings? Well, I think this opens the door to a certain amount of mischief. I'm going to illustrate that with a notorious headline from the satirical newspaper known as The Onion. I'm sure all of you have seen The Onion. Yes, it appeared about 2.5 years ago. It said, "Hijackers surprised to find themselves in hell. We expected eternal paradise for this, say suicide bombers." Well, it was criticized at the time for being of dubious taste, which it is, but I think it makes an important point, which is that even if there were people who could be deterred from committing evil by nothing other than a fear of spending eternity in hell, we know that there are people who are tempted to commit horrific acts by the promise of spending eternity in heaven. Finally, there's the secular fear of nihilism. And my favorite response to the secular fear, the fear from people who don't actually believe in a soul but still are kind of creeped out by these findings. But my favorite response comes from the opening scene of Woody Allen's movie Annie Hall, in which the 5-year-old Woody Allen character has been taken to the family doctor by his mother because he's depressed. The doctor says, "Why are you depressed, Alvy?" And his mother answers for him, "It's something he read." "Something he read, huh?" Alvy explains, "The universe is expanding." "The universe is expanding?" "Well, the universe is everything, and if it's expanding, someday it will break apart, and that would be the end of everything." And his mother says, "What is that your business?" "He stopped doing his homework." And Alvy says, "What's the point?" Well, the appropriate response came from his mother, who said, "What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding." Exactly right. We laugh at Alvey because he's confused two different time scales. The scale of human time, of years and decades, that determines what is meaningful to us and how we want to live our lives today, given the brains we have, and the scale of evolutionary time, of tens or hundreds of millions of years, that determine how and why our brain causes us to have those thoughts in the first place. Another way of putting it is that even if our genes are in some metaphorical sense selfish, and the process of evolution is amoral and without purpose, that doesn't mean that we are necessarily selfish or that we are amoral and without purpose. There's an old cliche that in politics that people who appreciate legislation and sausages should not watch them being made. The same might be true of human moral intuitions. My final point is that even if morality in some sense comes out of a moral sense that evolved in the brain, that doesn't mean that it is a complete fiction or figment of the imagination, but rather there's an inherent logic to morality that the human moral sense can be said to implement. And again, I'm going to use the comic pages to illustrate this argument, although it's quite ancient in Western philosophy. But some of the argument comes from the late lamented comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, in which one day Calvin says to Hobbes, "I don't believe in ethics anymore. As far as I'm concerned, the end justify the means. Get what you can while the getting's good, that's what I say. Might makes right. The winners write the history books. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not." "Hey," he says as Hobbes pushes him into the mud, "why'd you do that?" Hobbes says, "You were in my way. Now you're not. The ends justify the means." Calvin says, "I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me." Well, the absurdity of this position shows why there is an inherent basis to ethics, namely that as soon as your well-being depends on the behavior of other people, as it inevitably does, you can't insist that they adhere to a code of behavior that you are not willing to adhere to yourself. It's like saying that the particular spot that you happen to be standing on is a unique point in the universe just because you happen to be standing on it at that very moment. And it's this core idea of the interchangeability of perspectives, or the equivalence of interests between self and other, that really lies at the heart of all moral systems, such as the golden rule, the categorical imperative, the expanding circle, Rawls' veil of ignorance, and so on. So to sum up, I've argued that the dominant theory of human nature in modern intellectual life is based on the blank slate, the noble savage, and the ghost in the machine, that these ideas have been challenged by the modern sciences of mind, brain, genes, and evolution, that these challenges are also seen to threaten sacred moral values, but in fact that doesn't follow. On the contrary, I've suggested a better understanding of what makes us tick and of our place in nature can clarify those values, by showing that political equality does not require sameness, but rather policies that treat people as individuals with rights. That moral progress does not require that the mind is free of selfish motives, only that it has other motives to counteract them. That responsibility does not require that behavior is uncaused, only that it responds to contingencies of credit and blame. That meaning in life does not require that the process that shaped the brain have a purpose, only that the brain itself have a purpose. Finally, I've suggested that grounding values in a blank slate is a mistake. It's a mistake because it makes our values hostages to fortune, implying that someday empirical discoveries could make them obsolete. And it's a mistake because it conceals the downsides of denying human nature, including persecution of the successful, totalitarian social engineering, an exaggeration of the effects of the environment, such as in parenting and the criminal justice system, a mystification of the rationale behind responsibility, democracy, and morality, and the devaluing of human life on Earth. Thank you very much.
Steve, we have a gift for you in honor honor of your appearance here. You've agreed to answer some questions, and so we know you like to take your own questions and spice up life even more than it already is. So we'll let you have at it, and then I'll come up near the close. And also a reminder that after the question and answer session, Steve has graciously agreed to sign some books and answer any further questions outside in the UCROP gallery. So take it away.
Thank you, Bill. Yes.
I'm sorry, when you were talking about how the children are shaped not by their parents, but more by the genes and culture and chance.
That's right.
The one thing I know you're citing someone else's research, but can you maybe explain to me better how that there's a difference between like the culture that their peers that they're surrounded by and the environment that their parents give them? Is it just more overwhelming, or is there other differences?
No, I think that children are, the question, why would the parental environment be less effective than the peer environment, kind of cuts to the heart of the view of learning versus innate structure that I've been suggesting, namely that it's not while it's undeniable that learning is essential to all aspects of human life, the key point is that people are, in a sense, programmed to learn in certain ways and not others, to pay attention to certain kinds of information and to shut out others. And I think that includes children actively allowing themselves to be socialized by the best source of information about how to succeed in their own social ecosystem. And for that, peers are going to be a more reliable guide than parents. We see it just, by the way, empirically. If you think that this is implausible, just think about where children get their accent from. Children of immigrants, either immigrants from one country to another or one part of the country to another, will just about always end up not with the accent of their parents, but with the accent of their peers. And that's an illustration of what I have in mind, of the kids having antennae for what kinds of social learning they need to fit in with their group. And the ultimate reason, from I guess an evolutionary point of view, is that you find your mates from within your peer group, and you attract mates by your status in your peer group. And so I think it's not that surprising that children may be wired to learn in a particular way, namely to pay attention to which values will allow them to get ahead in the social environment in which they have to stake their claim and eventually find their mates. Yes? Yeah. I think it's a key question, and obviously if we could bottle that, we could make the world a much better place. I don't think we know the answer, but I'll give you some suggestions that have been offered. One of them is from the journalist Robert Wright in his book Non-Zero, in which he argues, he documents, as Singer does, this expansion of moral sensibilities, and suggests that a lot of it is due to technologies that allow for trade and wider networks of cooperation. That is, if it's easier to travel, to exchange goods, to divide labor, then other people become more valuable alive than dead, or autonomous than slaves. And as these networks of reciprocity and trade widen, the psychology adjusts accordingly. I mean, a cynical way to put it, the way he puts it, is that among the many reasons I think that we should not bomb the Japanese is that they made my minivan. A second possible mechanism of this expanding circle is ways of tweaking people's empathy by things like people-to-people exchanges, first-person narratives, realistic histories, and fiction that allow people to project themselves into the lives of others that were their former enemies, and that allow them to see the world in their shoes and therefore have more trouble dehumanizing them and convincing themselves that they're subhuman and don't have feelings that are equivalent to theirs. And the easier it is to mentally imagining trading places with someone, the more likely I think one is to include them in one's circle of empathy. So those are two mechanisms. Yeah. Quite right, and indeed, I mean, I think there's no easy answer to that. That is there any moral argument for preferring one's own kin to a stranger? I think there probably is, in that one has to, I mean, the way I would answer that would be that one has to acknowledge in any moral system the ability of real flesh and blood humans as opposed to angels to implement it. And given that we have a deep biological urge to care for our own kin above others, any system that fails to indulge that to some extent is going to be so unrealistic that it's not even worth discussing, because there's no chance in a million years that people will pay attention to it. So even if it is probably true from an abstract philosophical point of view, that if there are two kids in the daycare center on fire and you have to run in and save, say, your own child or two children of someone else, that ethically it's not defensible to save your own child, there has to be some adjustment, I think, in a moral system that would allow the person to save their own child. Yes?
In your book and in lecture, you mentioned sometimes rough treatment that Wilson and Ernstein received, both into Harvard faculty. Given that you've been challenging some widely held ideas, have you found the current climate any more tolerant than that experienced by Ernstein and Wilson before you?
Yeah, I think it is definitely more tolerant for a number of reasons. One of them is that whereas Wilson really didn't know what hit him, he did not see it coming. By his own words, he was a political naif. Whereas the ideas that I presented this evening and that I talked about in the book, The Blank Slate, were done in specific recognition and with the benefit of hindsight of these issues that I tried to address head on instead of courting them obliquely and being surprised by the aftermath. So no one reading the book could say, well, this is just an excuse for sexism and racism and perpetuation of injustice and so on, because the book explicitly talks about exactly that and why it isn't. So anyone who made that accusation could not have read the book. Also, I think there has been a change that in just the general sensibilities that students now, I think, are more open-minded and less likely to have a rigid ideology of political correctness that was common in the late 60s and 70s, that it's not considered a heresy nowadays to say that men and women are not indistinguishable in all respects, or that people have some not so nice impulses. Not that there hasn't been vehement criticism in reviews and opinion pieces and so on, but that, of course, is what you expect when you advance controversial ideas. In terms of actual suppressing of opportunities to speak or demonstrations or death threats or nothing like that. No, I haven't. I'm happy to say that I didn't get anything like that. Yes?
To the parenting and your references to Judith Harris's work, which I also found very persuasive in the context in which she wrote that. But then when I consider, if we could go to a non-human model, Michael Meany's work, where he finds that the number of times that a mother rat licks its infant has lifelong changes in stress responsivity, possibly mental health. And I think to mention something, I can't remember who did this work, but at a conference last summer in Montreal, mother and infant
Well, the study of humans with the number of books in the house suffers from the flaw of not having genetic controls unless it looked at adopted children. Because there you could say, well, smart people tend to have a lot of books, smart people tend to have smart children, and so that correlation may not be a causal effect. That would be the problem with that kind of study. Now, the study with rats does not have that flaw, assuming that it was an experimental study. So it was an experimental intervention rather than a correlational study. Although I would hesitate to attribute too much to that, simply because the rat life history is so different from a human's. I mean, if you see a baby rat, it's like a little pink jelly bean. Rats are highly altricial. The early maternal behavior toward the rat is kind of a continuation of what in other species would be the environment in the womb. And I think it's very hard to extrapolate to humans. Also, I would add that cases that are outside the envelope of the normal range of behavior, things where you really do some extreme manipulation, can surely make kids worse. There are all kinds of ways of making kids worse, just as there are all kinds of ways of damaging anything. But it's another question of what deserves credit when the kid turns out properly in the absence of some clearly injurious or neglectful or pathological treatment. So I wouldn't deny that you can mess up a kid in all kinds of ways. The question is, does the normal range of parenting or the kinds of interventions that fall within the advice manuals make any difference at all? And the suggestion is that that variation probably doesn't, even if cases of criminal abuse and neglect might. Yes, Ping.
You have argued very forcefully against the Blank Slate view, which says experience shapes human nature. On the other hand, there has been emerging neuroscience evidence that suggests that the brain, the human brain and the human mind is very plastic. From neural rewiring to the change and the adaptation of the structure of the brain. How do you look at this evidence, this type of evidence? Is that compatible with your view of your arguments, your arguments?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter in the book on neuroplasticity. Well, some cases of neuroplasticity simply flesh out the idea that has to be true, namely that whenever there is learning or development, there has to be a change in the brain, in the physical structure of the brain. And that must be true if there's no such thing as a ghost in the machine. Because if there's learning, the learning has to consist of some change in the brain. And a lot of what's called plasticity is simply learning described at the neural level. Other cases, which I review, I think are not as dramatic as they're often described. For one thing, there isn't indefinite plasticity in the brain. Early damage to temporal lobes, early damage to frontal lobes can leave permanent damage, and other parts of the brain can't compensate. And some of the cases, the experimentally induced cases, are really cases in which some kind of circuitry that I think is as useful in the visual input as in the auditory input are made to substitute for each other. So, for example, the extraction of contours in vision is similar to the extraction of transitions in audition, and the, say, cases of substitution where visual input to an auditory system can induce visually responsive neurons may simply be exploiting circuitry that was useful for audition and feeding it with visual inputs. So I think that there's been a tendency to describe changes in the brain using a metaphor that I actually think is not terribly appropriate, namely plasticity, which implies that there is some molding from external shape. There is no doubt change in the brain as a function of input, but I think a lot of it can be understood as simply meshing of the input with certain circuits that are useful for tasks in different parts of the brain. But anyway, I go into, because I was anticipating that question, I have a fairly detailed discussion of neuroplasticity in one of the chapters of called the Plastic Slate. Yes? Well, it's a double-edged sword because at the same time, it could lead to greater acceptance of oneself. If there is the idea that I can make of myself anything that I want, and if I fail, it must be because I haven't gotten with the program, or I haven't tried hard enough, or I don't have enough moral backbone. That could be depressing in contrast with the idea that there are certain parts of me that I'm unlikely to change, although I can figure out how to lead a rewarding life, taking them into account. Just to give an example, and this comes from a discussion that I had with Martin Seligman in Slate magazine, Martin Seligman wrote a book on happiness that came out at the same time as the Blank Slate, where he pointed out there's a lot of evidence, for example, that mean happiness level is largely heritable. That is, there are people who are just happier throughout their lives than other people within a certain range. Does that mean that we shouldn't try to make ourselves happier, that we should just resign ourselves? Well, not necessarily, for two reasons. One of them is that what you inherit is a range of happiness levels, and you could try to strive for the higher point in the range, even if you may not ultimately be as happy on a day-to-day basis as someone who always has a spring in their step and a smile on their face. You may not be able to turn a sad sack into a barrel of monkeys, but you could make them happier than they are, or you could make yourself somewhat happier. Also, happiness isn't everything. There are many people who live lives that by any standard are fulfilling and worthwhile and lives worth living, but just didn't happen to be in a good mood all the time. Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill would be two examples that Seligman points out, and that one could develop aspects of oneself that clearly do depend on effort and of one's own self-persuasion, even if they don't affect this stable aspect of temperament and personality. So it's really a question of knowing, as the old thing says, the old saw, knowing what you can change, accepting what you can't, and knowing how to tell the difference. I guess it was Reinhold Niebuhr who had that credited with that aphorism. Let's see from the back. Yes. Yeah, no, you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment, given your theories and research on human nature, about this whole gay marriage debate.
Well, I don't think there's a strong implications, largely because it's, like many issues, really more of a political and moral issue than an empirical one, except that just to say that there seems to be very strong evidence that sexual orientation is not something that people choose in the same sense that they choose whether to take a job or not, what state to live in, and so on. But it's reported by people that homosexual orientation is involuntary and emerges in the same way that heterosexual orientation does in heterosexual people, and more so for men than women, but to some extent in both cases. And that's a consideration that should enter into the debate in terms of what one would encourage or discourage by these alternative policies, although it doesn't dictate the answer to that debate.
We want to thank Steve again for such an exceptional and broad-ranging discussion. Thank you. Let me again thank each of you for coming, for your wonderful questions, for Steve's wonderful answers, and he will, as I mentioned before, be available outside in the UCrop Gallery in a few minutes to sign books and to answer a few questions. And I have one on why human conceptions of the afterlife differ so much for heaven and hell, and we'll talk.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.